Hey guys, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you twins. Daniel and David have always made all the important decisions together since they were kids. They both chose to work as mechanics, cheered for the same sports team, and often finished each other's sentences. No one could have guessed that one day the brothers would plan an almost perfect crime together. After all, even if the police had managed to find traces of DNA, the prosecutor would not have been able to convince a jury of Dan or David's guilt. Standard forensic DNA analysis as of today cannot distinguish between identical twins because they have virtually identical genetic profiles, and a jury will always have room for reasonable doubt. It took law enforcement officials 10 years to catch the brothers. It was only because David decided to make a deal with the prosecutor and testified against Daniel that the police were able to solve the case. That will be discussed today. On July 22nd, 2003, the car of her husband, with whom the 30-year-old woman was in the process of divorce, drove up to the house of Heather's parents. The final divorce hearing was only a week away. The man got out of the car with a huge bouquet of flowers and a card with a touching picture, heading toward the house, hoping that he would still be able to reconcile and avoid divorce. The reason to keep the marriage alive was not because of his great love for his spouse or his desire to keep the family cozy. Daniel realized the court decision to pay alimony would not leave money for his usual life. Perhaps he even lost the house. The man was desperately looking for a way out and expected to solve the problem with a bouquet of flowers and promises. The plan failed. Heather firmly rejected Daniel's proposal. The conversation turned violent, and Heather's father, Dave Springer, even had to intervene. Only after Dave promised to call the police did Daniel angrily yell that Heather was ruining his life and leave the house. Springer, a former member of the Denver Police Department, realized by some special instinct that his son-in-law was dangerous to his daughter. He asked her not to see him for the rest of the divorce proceedings. He would later say, "I was worried about what my son-in-law, Daniel, might do." As the final divorce approached, he wanted to keep things under his control, but control was slipping away from him, and he was becoming more and more desperate, more and more hostile. "I told Heather not to date him, and I didn't think she would, but she did." 2 days later, Dan called Heather and offered to pick up the children's medical records and assign child support check. Initially, the now almost ex-spouses agreed to meet at McDonald's. The young woman did not want to be alone with her ex-husband and planned to meet in a crowded place, taking her 2 children who were 5 and 3 years old at the time. She didn't say anything to the father, alerting only the mother to the meeting. Obviously, something went wrong. The plan changed, or she originally named the nearest fast food restaurant as the meeting place to appease her mother. But Heather went not to McDonald's, but to Daniel's home in Edgewater, Colorado, where he lived at the time with his identical twin brother, David, and David's then-girlfriend, Roseanne. Heather felt that in the presence of the children, Jacob and Hannah, their father would not be aggressive, and he was not alone at home. And then the young woman disappeared. She was never seen alive again. Heather Springer was born on April 21st, 1973, in Arvada, Colorado. The head of the household, David Springer, who worked for the Denver Police Department, was respected by his colleagues and was highly regarded as a professional in his field. The man did everything possible to make sure that his beloved wife, Carol, Heather, and her 2 older sisters, Rebecca and Jennifer, had everything they needed. The family had a friendly, warm atmosphere of mutual understanding. For her sisters, their father was a model of masculinity, responsibility, and care. In her youth, Heather tried to build relationships with her peers, but nothing much came out. When she met Dan DeWilde, who was 10 years older than her, she saw in him an adult, responsible, caring man and felt as calm and safe as with her father. Daniel, being a mature man, was winning in Heather's eyes compared to his peers. The 23-year-old young woman fell in love without looking back. The couple began dating in 1996, and a year later, Dan made an offer which Heather gladly accepted. She grew up in a family where her father, due to his professional activities, always showed control, and the same quality in the groom she automatically considered a manifestation of love and protection. Unfortunately, she was mistaken. The young couple moved to the town of Edgewater, Colorado, where Dan owned a home. 2 children were born to the family, Hannah and Jacob. Heather devoted herself completely to her daughter and son, doing the household chores. Dan, as the main breadwinner of the family, worked as a mechanic in the transportation department. However, in family life, it was not all. cloudless. Gradually, the young woman realized that Dan's excessive control is not a manifestation of care and love. Over time, he only became more overwhelming and restrictive. Dreams of a happy union did not materialize. After 5 years of marriage in 22, Heather began to complain to her parents about her husband. She said that she was tired of Dan's constant control. It was simply unbearable to live with him in the same house. A year later, in the spring of 2003, the young woman informed Dan that she wanted a divorce. She packed her things and moved with her children to her parents' house in Arvada. Dan reacted very negatively to her still legal spouse's actions and even threatened her, which only strengthened her decision to protect her interests and those of her children. She filed for divorce, sought custody of the children, and had her husband pay child support. The situation became stressful for Daniel because he was not prepared for the additional considerable financial obligations. He was afraid that he would not be able to pay the bills and would likely lose his home. In early summer, his brother David came to Dan's aid, along with his roommate Roseanne, to provide support and help with the difficult situation. Dan and David, identical twins with only a minute and a half difference in age, have been inseparable all their lives, constantly helping each other, keeping in touch. Friends of the twins noted that Dan always acted as a leader, making key decisions, while David preferred to stay in the shadow of his brother and occupy secondary positions. After arriving, David started working as a mechanic at the same place where Dan worked and gave a significant amount of money to his brother to pay the house bills. It was David who suggested that Dan try to prevent a final divorce and supported his idea of going to see Heather on July 22, 23. The trip, as is already known, ended in failure and almost calling the police. The brothers then devised a new plan, inviting Heather to their home on July 24th. The distance from Heather's parents' house to the nearest McDonald's was only a few kilometers. The daughter, who had only gone to pick up her papers, should have returned long ago. When an hour passed, Heather's mom, Carol Springer, became concerned. Her daughter wasn't picking up her cell phone, and Carol called her son-in-law to find out where Heather was. Dan reported that she had arrived at his house, left the kids, and drove off in her car to the store. All of this seemed alarming to Carol since she knew her daughter's wallet and credit cards were left at home. She couldn't go shopping without the money and cards, and she certainly would never leave her grandchildren with Dan. Freezing with a bad feeling, an agitated Carol dialed Dave's number and told him who her daughter had gone to see and when. Dave Springer immediately went to his former son-in-law's house. Heather wasn't there, and her car was nowhere to be found either. Dan still maintained that Heather had gone away on her own business, leaving the children with him. She should be back soon. The grandchildren couldn't tell their grandparents where their mom was or where she had gone. Dave called the emergency services. With his experience as a police officer, he sensed that his daughter was in trouble. Soon, patrol officers arrived at Dan and David's house. The officers inspected the area near the house and the house itself, which Dan allowed them to enter, but found nothing suspicious outside or inside, then left. The only thing the officers were able to find out was that the medical records Heather had come for were at Dan's house, and the child support check was still unsigned. Dave Springer got behind the wheel of his auto and began driving the city street, hoping to find his daughter alive. Passing intersections, he stopped his gaze on passers-by, looked at the faces of women, interviewed local residents, but the search was fruitless. The next morning, July 25th, Heather DeWilde was officially reported missing. Detective Mark Crater of the Denver Police Department joined the search for the woman. The detective took Dave's suspicions seriously. No one believed that Heather simply decided to run away on vacation from her family. Already after the trip, Crater told reporters, Dave was obviously extremely concerned. The case was unusual because the daughter of a Denver police officer was missing, and that personalized the situation a little bit. Mark Crater's first stop was the DeWilde home. The detective arrived at the address, rang the doorbell. Dan DeWilde himself appeared on the doorstep. He wouldn't let the detective into the house without David's cooperation. Crater had no right to inspect the house, which meant that important evidence could be missed. The detective asked what the reason for the refusal was and why DeWilde was unwilling to help the investigation. If things were as he said they were, Dan replied that he had a personal attorney and would only answer questions in his presence. At that moment, David, Dan's twin, drove up to the house. Dan immediately called out to his brother, telling him not to engage in conversation with the detective. As Crater watched, he realized that Heather's father was right. Daniel DeWilde was hiding something. Why did he hire a lawyer if Heather just got tired of the family and left? He's not at all worried about the woman or looking for her, even though he swore his love for her a few days ago. Everything seemed as strange as possible, but the detective couldn't do anything without a warrant, and he had to leave. By the time police obtained a search warrant for DeWilde's home, Heather had been missing for 6 days. Inside the home, Crater's task force found no evidence of a crime weapon, nor was there any indication that Heather had been in the house. But investigators soon learned that on the day the young woman disappeared, David drove his Chevrolet car to an auto repair shop about 15 miles from the house. Why would David drive that far when the twins worked for the transportation department as mechanics and could have handled the car repairs themselves? Crater got a warrant to look at the Chevrolet. Detectives speculated that perhaps Heather was dead and David had managed to hide her body away from home. To conduct an inspection of the car, they brought in specially trained dogs that reacted to the odor of a decomposing body. While checking David's car, the dogs began barking near the driver's rear side door, indicating that Heather's body may have been in the car for some time. Detective Crater met and spoke with David and described the search dog's reactions. At one point, the detective, looking directly into David's eyes, asked, "Did you kill Heather?" The man lowered his head, and you could see how nervous he was. The man said he needed to talk to his lawyer and left. After talking to David, the detective had no doubt that both twin brothers were involved in Heather's disappearance. A day after receiving news that the dog smelled decomposition, David and Roseanne married, solidifying the police's suspicions. Roseanne later revealed that it happened so suddenly, just in case because spouses are not required to testify against each other. Then, on August 4th, 23, 2 weeks after Heather's disappearance, police found a white Nissan Sentra belonging to the missing Heather in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Wheat Ridge, Colorado, about 5 miles from Dan's home. According to locals, the car had been parked there for several days with the passenger side window completely open. Detectives spent all day scrutinizing the car. It appeared so clean that there was no evidence that even Heather had ever ridden in it. We found no evidence of Heather's DNA inside or outside the car. We also found no fingerprints or anything else that would indicate that Heather had used the vehicle, the expert explained to Detective Crater. Apparently, the perpetrator or perpetrators were careful and wiped out all traces. Qualitatively, investigators searched the wooded area south of the apartment complex where the car was found. They used trackers, thermal imaging cameras, and a police helicopter. The search, to their dismay, yielded no clues that could lead to Heather. It was at that moment that Carol and Dave realized they had lost their daughter forever. Exactly 1 month later, on September 4th, 23, Heather's body was discovered by a road worker shoveling dirt on the road to the canyon. He noticed a large trash bag in the ground, and when he got closer, he called the police. In the meantime, the body had decomposed so badly that dental records had to be used for identification. The woman's face was covered with a mask made of duct tape, and rope was wrapped around her neck and wrists. The body was wrapped in garbage bags and secured with duct tape before being placed in a shallow grave. Family members identified the clothing as the one Heather left in to meet Daniel on July 24th. The medical examiner was unable to determine Heather's exact cause of death, but the nature of her injuries suggested that she was strangled or died of asphyxiation. Investigators realized that the twins were involved. The location where the body was found was in the same neighborhood as the workshop that David visited the day Heather disappeared. The trash bags in which the body was wrapped matched the general class characteristics of the bags taken from the deed home. But it was circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence was lacking, and Crater couldn't apprehend even one of the brothers, let alone both of them. Dave Springer felt crushed by the impossibility of doing anything. Heather was buried. Her parents placed a note in their daughter's castle with the phrase, "All she wanted was to love and be loved." There was a languid wait. No one told Heather's parents and sisters about the details of the investigation. It even began to seem to them that no one was dealing with the case at all. In fact, the investigation understood who was guilty, but the lack of evidence tied the hands of detectives. After 2 years, in 2005 in Denver, changed the district attorney who promised the Springer family to help in the investigation of the case. The formed investigation team once again thoroughly reviewed 500 pages of documentation and re-examined all the evidence and details of the case. However, these efforts yielded no new results. There was no physical evidence. DNA analysis did not reveal any links between the brothers and Heather's death. Detectives believed that in addition to the brothers, the case could be involved in David's wife, Roseanne, who also lived in the house. But as an official spouse, she had the right not to disclose information about her husband. And so another 4 years passed. Heather's family still did not find a place. The father of the deceased admitted that sometimes he screams at night. He was sickened by the fact that Dan was sleeping peacefully on the loose while their entire family was facing daily injustice. In 2009, the Heather DeWilde investigation was taken over by Russ Bootwright. The new prosecutor took the task with the utmost seriousness. In 6 years, the volume of documentation grew from 1 in 12 to 30,000 pages. There were 15 additional boxes with important details. After a while, a DVD of home movies caught the attention of the new investigative team. It turned out that during their marriage, Dan and Heather had engaged in unusual practices. Dan played the dominant role, and Heather willingly submitted. Dan liked to tie Heather up. When detectives examined the home videotape, they discovered an important coincidence. The way Dan was tying up in this footage was very similar to the way the woman was tied up when her body was discovered. Detectives also identified Dan's profile on a dating site where he listed himself as a widower, even though Heather was reported missing at the time and her body had not yet been found. During the investigation, they were able to find a witness who had seen Dan, David, and Roseanne early one morning near the spot where Heather's body was later found. In addition, thanks to new technology that has emerged in recent years, experts were able to reinvestigate phone conversations between David, Daniel, and Roseanne on the day of the crime. All three made 14 calls to each other, and detectives have now been able to find out the geographical location of each caller. David's cell phone was used right near where Heather's car was found, and from there he called his brother and then Roseanne. Combining all of the information obtained, detectives brought the perpetrators to justice. With only circumstantial evidence, more than 8 years after the crime was committed, Dan, David, and Roseanne DeWilde were arrested on December 14, 2011. Each was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. As prosecutors prepared for trial, investigators hoped to somehow provoke the DeWildes. They hypothesized that Roseanne might be the weak link and tried to turn her against the brothers. It didn't work. The woman continued to claim that neither she nor the twins were involved in the crime. Dan, David, and Roseanne spent 8 months behind bars awaiting trial. The first to break down was David. 9 years after the crime, the man confessed that Heather took the life of his twin brother Dan. Maybe it was the arrest, the billing records, or maybe he really loved Roseanne and wanted to get her out of harm's way by making a deal with the prosecutor. Or maybe he just analyzed everything and chose freedom after 12 years rather than waiting a lifetime for sentencing. Either way, David took the deal. If it wasn't for his testimony, the brothers probably would have gotten away with the crime. David gave all the gruesome details. According to the man, his brother Dan began planning the crime back in April 2023 after he was ordered to pay child support. He carefully thought out every move he made. When Dan told David about his plan and asked for help, he said that in case of refusal, he would still get rid of Heather, but only alone. David admitted that he was afraid for his brother. He thought that Dan couldn't do it alone. He would be caught and put in jail immediately. So David agreed to help. According to the plan, Heather and the children arrived at noon on July 24, 2023. When Dan went to meet them, David allegedly tried to stop his brother, but he didn't listen. While the children played in the house, Dan took Heather to the garage, promising to return the now almost ex-wife's joint videos, which were allegedly stored there. In the garage, Dan grabbed Heather by the shoulders and threw her to the floor. According to David, he could have prevented the crime but didn't, continuing to just stand there and watch in silence. His brother took a hammer from the shelf and struck Heather several blows to the head, rendering her unconscious. Immediately after that, Dan took a rope, tied his wife up the same way he had tied her up during their intimate games, but this time he made a noose around her neck as well, and then suspended her from the garage roof. Dan's plan was that he wanted to make it look like his wife's death was an accident during their role-playing sessions. Leaving Dan in the garage, David drove Heather's car back to the apartment complex parking lot and thoroughly wiped the car down inside and out. By the time David returned to the garage, his brother had already wrapped his wife's body in garbage bags and placed it in the back seat of David's car. David checked the woman's pulse and made sure she was dead. He then got behind the wheel of the Chevrolet and drove to the pre-planned location where he was going to bury the body. Heather might never have been found if it hadn't been for a transmission problem in the car that forced him to hide the body elsewhere on the way to the canyon because David had to stop by an auto repair shop to get his car fixed. The investigation got clues about the car's movements. When asked by the investigators how the brothers managed to get rid of all the evidence so professionally, David said that they regularly watched crime programs on TV and they gave a lot of information on these issues. For example, they used double gloves to leave no traces. David DeWilde had to take a polygraph to confirm the veracity of his testimony. After the test, prosecutors offered him a deal. David pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit second-degree murder and received 12 years instead of life in prison. In November 2012, Daniel's trial began at the Jefferson County Courthouse. David testified, blamed the crime entirely on his brother, rehabilitated his wife, Roseanne, through his testimony, apologized for all the pain he had caused to Heather's family, and received 12 years. Daniel pleaded not guilty and continued to insist he did not know where Heather went after she allegedly left the house. His defense claimed that Heather took his brother David's life. After all, by his own admission, he was the one who disposed of the car and the body. But the jury didn't believe that version. They found Daniel guilty of conspiracy to commit a first-degree felony, but couldn't decide if he actually did it. Because of this, the judge set a new trial date just a month later. Fearing he would end up in prison with no chance of parole, Dan accepted a plea deal, pleaded guilty to a second-degree felony, and waived his right to appeal. He was sentenced to 74 years in prison, which he continues to serve in Colorado State Prison. He will become eligible for parole in May 2045. His mandatory release year is 2084, when he will be over 100 years old. Daniel DeWilde will likely not live to see that date. After the trial, prosecutor Russ Bootwright said at a press conference, looking at the dynamics of what happened, it's pretty clear that Daniel set David up. He was in control of the situation. As for Mary Roseanne DeWilde, we ultimately concluded that her knowledge of the events was less than previously thought. The case against her is dismissed as there is no reasonable likelihood of her conviction at trial. Roseanne continues to maintain that she didn't suspect anything and is waiting for David to be released. After Dan's arrest, Hannah and Jacob were taken into foster care by their own grandparents. Heather's parents, Dave Springer, Heather's father, has finally begun to sleep well at night. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click the bell. There are many shocking stories ahead.